Thanks again, everyone, for coming. This was kind of a quick week to let everyone know about this, but we're glad to see so many folks here talk about fall planting today. And this is probably going to be a little bit of a shorter webinar, maybe 20 to 30 minutes long. We're going to run through some crops that you can still plant in your gardens and a few general guidelines for fall planting. And I'm going to be talking specifically about fall planting here in Decorah, Iowa, in Zone 4B, as far as dates and other things like that go. But all of this is applicable to any other place here in the country where you're going to be expecting a frost here in September, October, November. You'll just have to adjust the dates, and I'll show you a little bit on how to do that as well. So we're going to talk about fall planting. A couple advantages to fall planting. One is that you can, in some cases, get a little bit of a doubled harvest for your area. If you've got an area of ground that you've already pulled up a lot of your plants, maybe you've already pulled out your lettuce and your radishes and some other crops, that's a lot of room in the garden for you to plant again, so you can increase the production in your garden. Lots of crops also have a sweeter flavor associated with the frosts that come in the fall. After a frost, a lot of the carbohydrates that those plants are storing energy into convert into sugar, and so with things like kales and broccolis and cabbages, peas, you get a really fantastic flavor. There's also, in many cases, reduced pest pressure in the fall. Spring planting coincides with a lot of pests, and I think specifically of flea beetles that really devastate our eggplant and our Asian green crops when we plant them in the spring, but then when we plant them back in the fall, those same insects have sort of already gone through their life cycle and they are not as big of a pressure on the plants in the garden. So several advantages to planting in the fall in addition to planting in the spring. There are a couple of things to do for prep before you put anything back into the soil. The first one would be and not necessarily a prep, but something to keep in mind, is that you want to be rotating crops through a garden patch. If you sowed radishes in one particular area, you've pulled all the radishes out, you could consider sowing lettuce or spinach or something from a different plant family in that same spot, so that you're not planting the same thing over and over and over again in the soil. You also want to add some nutrients back into the soil. This is really important because you're asking the soil to do double duty. If you think about it that way, they've already given up a lot of nutrients to the previous crop, and if you're going to be planting something back in that same spot, you want to add a little bit of nutrition to the soil. You also want to, in some cases, depending on what you're going to be planting, shade the soil as well, particularly for things that need cooler soil for the seeds to germinate if you're direct sowing them. Things like beets and Swiss chard, spinach, lettuce, they all like cooler temperatures for seed germination. And if your particular garden is in a garden spot like ours is, temperature here is getting up in the 90s. It's been a pretty cool summer, but still that soil is too warm for seeds to germinate. So it's really important to either shade the soil or mulch the soil in anticipation of kind of cooling that soil down. And another way to cool the soil down is to water it well. And in the spring, the soil is very, very moist because, here at least, the soil is very, very moist because the snow is all melted. It's really saturated with water, and so we don't have that in the middle of the summer, and so it's really important to water really well over the course of the few days right before you plant. And then this is also a time to add any protective structures that you are going to use for season extension or for pest control if you're going to be putting up row cover later in the fall. For season extension, it's a lot easier right now at this time while you're preparing the beds while nothing's planted there to put in the ribs or to put in any other supports that you might need for row cover, for screens, for other things like that. I'm going to separate fall planted crops into two categories, either quick maturing plants or frost tolerant plants. And we're going to talk about quick maturing crops first. So here in Decorah, Iowa, our first sort of anticipated frost date might be September 22nd. There's a 10% chance that by September 22nd we will have a frost here. There's a 50% chance that by October 4th we're going to have a frost here. So when you're thinking about planting your garden, if you anticipate, or if you've heard that the fall is going to be milder or the fall is going to be, frosts are going to hold off for a little bit, you can sort of play with that particular first frost date depending on how optimistic you are for how long the season is going to go, and then sort of base your analysis of how many frost-free days left on whichever number. If in this case I'm Not convinced that the frost is necessarily going to hold off until October 4th, and I want to play it cautious. So I'm used September 22nd as the anticipated first frost date. You can find these zone maps often have this information. Extension agencies have this information as well. Using September 22nd, I counted back the number of days till today's date, and we've got about 60 frost-free days left here in Decorah. So for quick maturing crops, if you're looking for ideas on what to plant, take a look at the days to maturity listed with particular plant varieties and use that as kind of your first estimate of what you can conceivably harvest in that time. Keep in mind that as the season goes on, things are going to get cooler, and as they get cooler, things will start to slow down their growth. Many of the things, not necessarily everything you've got in the garden, but a lot of things are going to slow down. Cucumbers are going to slow down. Squash is going to slow down. There's lots of crops that are going to slow down quite a bit. So if it says 50 days to maturity for a cucumber, it's going to take a little bit longer. It might take an extra week or 2 weeks for that crop to mature fully, just because it's going to be so much cooler later in the year. So there are plenty of times here. If you've got at least 60 days, there's plenty of time for green bush beans. Pole beans perhaps as well, but bush beans typically ripen earlier, and so there's plenty of time to still plant bush beans. Plenty of time to still plant some beets, and beets will prefer cool soil. The beans you can plant directly into the soil right now, they'll germinate. But beets, however, you want to cool the soil down by shading it, mulching it, and watering it really well. And chard as well, the same species as beet. Chard has very similar conditions that are ideal for seed germination and growth, so chard as well can be planted with plenty of time, and they prefer cool soil as well. It'll be a close call to get cucumbers in. Like I said, cucumbers will sort of slow their growth down a little bit later as the temperatures start to drop, but a lot of cucumbers are ready in 45 to 55 days, so there is still time for cucumbers. Zucchini as well, depending on the variety, you could get a very, very early variety of of zucchini that might be ready in 45, 55 days. Keep in mind that it's going to slow down a little bit later in the year. I guess get started now. And zucchini you can plant right into the soil. You don't have to cool the soil down. They love the heat, and they'll get it off to a really great start, much better than zucchini that you might have planted in the spring. So those are some crops that mature really quickly, and those were crops that I found that would mature quick enough to fit within that 60-day limit. If you live in a different zone and you've got a little bit more time, you could still have time for melons and watermelons that mature really quickly. Those are also going to slow their growth down quite a bit towards the end of the season. But there are some other crops as well that'll mature in time. But going through our commercial catalog, the catalog from our seed house, that was about all that was available that would mature within that time period. There are also lots of frost-tolerant crops that can tolerate a little bit of frost, so even though the first frost is in potentially 60 days, these crops that I'm going to talk about next can withstand that a little bit. They can withstand a light frost. Some of them can withstand a pretty heavy frost. So broccoli is something that will be fine in a frost and actually gets sweeter in a frost along with its other brassica family relatives. So broccoli should be started indoors, preferably for this zone several weeks ago. And for broccoli, broccoli, it may be very close to too late to start indoors here, but you may be able to find nurseries, and there's lots of, like here at Seed Savers Exchange at Heritage Farm, the Visitor Center is going to have crops available for fall planting, plants that we've already started here. And there are some other seed companies and plant companies that do that as well. They'll sell transplants in the fall as well. So if you get a hold of those, you can absolutely stick them in the ground. It's just that the seed should have been started about now and then planted out in just a few weeks. So broccoli, Brussels sprouts, exactly the same. Brussels sprouts love frost, and they can last a really long time just in a garage, in a root cellar, in a basement, someplace that's cool and somewhat humid. Those Brussels sprouts will stay looking really, really good if you harvest the whole stalk and bring it inside. Cabbage as well. Cabbage should have been started indoors as well and can still produce a nice head. Kale is something that can even be started indoors now with broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts and cabbages. They don't have a fruit that they're producing, but they do have, broccoli needs to have the broccoli florets for it to be ready to harvest. Cabbage needs to have, or maybe preferably has, some sort of head. Brussels sprouts have lots and lots of tiny heads that they develop. But kale, You're just eating the greenery sort of as it grows. So you can plant kale pretty late. The plants might never get very big, but you're going to be able to harvest quite a bit, and so you could still start kale from seeds indoors right now. Kohlrabi as well, pretty similar to cabbages. Preferably they would have been started indoors already, but there might still be time to just get a very small kohlrabi bulb. And I don't know what happened to the picture of parsnips, but parsnips can also be, I'm not sure what happened to the parsnips picture, but parsnips can be direct sown right now, maybe ideally here in zone 4B a couple weeks ago, but they do really need that cool soil. Parsnips are frost tolerant, but they could be direct sown right now as well, and that frost may sort of start to kill off some of that greenery, but the roots inside should still be alright. You want to make sure that you're harvesting the parsnip roots certainly before the ground freezes solid, at which point it's going to be really, really difficult to dig them up. There's several root crops that are very, very similar to the parsnips. They can be direct sown now, and they really need that cool soil. So again, shade the soil, water really well, potentially mulch that soil, and keep that cool until the seeds germinate and start to grow. Rutabagas, again, they can withstand a little bit of frost, and the roots will be just fine, but do get them out of the ground before the ground freezes solid. Carrots, same exact thing as rutabagas. Plant them now, cool the soil down, harvest before the ground freezes. And leeks and scallions can also be planted right now. Onions won't really form a nice bulb for storage in time for the fall, but leeks and scallions you can eat at very different stages of their life cycle. Onions as well, obviously, but they need cool soil, and they should be harvested shortly after a frost. A few other things to direct sow now, and these are not necessarily very frost hardy, particularly the lettuce and the radish greens. These should be direct sown now into cool soil, and they'll have plenty of time to grow and to develop and for you to harvest them. And they do really, really like growing in cool conditions. So as the temperatures continue to drop, they'll do better and better. They'll also, if you planted radishes now and didn't take measures to keep the soil cool, both of them would bolt pretty quickly, and you wouldn't get much of a harvest. But these can also be direct sown over the course of several weeks. So you could be direct sowing these now. You could be direct sowing them in a couple weeks, and then again in a couple more weeks. Still plenty of time. There's some radishes that are ready to be eaten in 30 days, 35 days. So still got lots of time to sow successive radishes. A few things that can be direct sown now, but can also be direct sown a little bit later. Things that mature really, really quickly or grow really well in cool soil: arugula, Asian greens, lettuce, as I mentioned, turnip, spinach, and mustard. These can all be sown now. They can be sown in a couple weeks. They really need those cool temperatures to thrive and to produce a really tasty crop. I'll talk a little bit about protecting from frost. I'm not going to cover season extension really, but as the frost sort of looms closer, as you're taking a look at the temperatures, when here towards the end of September, in early October, there are a couple of things that you can do if your beans aren't quite ready. If you've got a couple other things that are not going to do well in a frost, but they're not quite ready yet. The first is row cover. So putting a row cover, potentially like this, just some old sheets that have been hung up over the top of a bean trellis here and tied together. Frost will land on that, and it'll won't quite get to the plants. This is an actual row cover, not just old sheets that we've hung up on the bean trellis, but this row cover here as well can be put out over the plants. And I think garden centers are increasingly making these row covers available. There's lots and lots of different weights. There's light row cover that's good for light frost. There's heavier row covers that cost quite a bit more, but can protect from frost and cold temperatures quite a bit better. And I've seen a lot of nurseries recently that have started selling it by the foot. So they've got a big roll. You can request how much you want, and then you can put that over your crop. Another way to protect from the frost is to mulch really well. Mulching over the roots also, if a very, very hard frost is coming, putting a straw mulch or something, leaf litter mulch, that you can then pretty easily remove from the plants afterwards. You can mulch to protect from frost as well. And then also keeping the soil very well watered a great way to protect from frost damage. You can also, if you have like a sprinkler system and a frost is coming, I've heard of some the last minute folks that realized that the temperature is getting very, very cold. They haven't protected for frost. They've gone out and turned the sprinklers on, and putting all that moisture into the water really reduces the risk of frost occurring. And so watering really well beforehand, or in fact watering while the rest of your property is frosting. A couple ways to protect from frost. The very last thing that I want to mention, something not to forget about, is garlic, which is fall planted here in a couple months, but in fact we're harvesting garlic right now to sell through the seed house and ship in just a few weeks after it dries out a little bit and cures. We'll be shipping out garlic, and garlic is kind of the ultimate fall planted crop. You plant it in the fall, it overwinters, and then you harvest it. You harvest it right about now, actually, here in this zone. So I've covered quite a few different crops. I haven't covered all. I tried to cover the major crops. There are certainly other crops that could be yet sown for the fall. I'm thinking of oric, thinking of some other greens, mustard, which maybe I did mention, several other things that can be sown now. Keep in mind that if it's something that needs to fruit, like a tomato needs to fruit, it's got a very defined sort of maturity date. But other things like lettuces, like even like beet greens and chard, you can eat them really at any time. So if you're not quite sure you have enough time to get to reach sort of the maturity date that's listed on the seed packet or in the seed catalog, if you can eat it at any time, really you still should feel like you've got lots of time to plant it, and then just sow it extra thick and then harvest smaller greens. But you can get almost as much produce from the same area just by harvesting early and planting really, really thickly. So thanks everyone, and enjoy your fall planting.